Tonight, we uncover the names the Church tried hardest to forget. Gods so ancient, so deeply woven into the land, that even when their temples fell and their worship was outlawed, the earth itself refused to let them die. They were not demons, though the priests called them that. They were not myths, though history tried to silence them. They were the Celtic gods, the ones who ruled before heaven had borders, before saints replaced spirits, before faith demanded obedience instead of balance. And for a time, their power stretched across every field, forest, and flame. But when the cross rose over Ireland, something older stirred beneath it. The Church arrived with its Gospels and its Latin, ready to baptize the wild. Yet what it found could not be washed away. The people prayed by candlelight on Sunday, then left milk for the spirits on Monday. They spoke in two languages, one for salvation, one for memory, and in that secret world the gods still listened. The monks sent to convert them began to notice something unsettling: fires that refused to go out, wells that healed without blessing, names that reappeared in songs even when banned from speech. Lugh, the god of every art; Brigid, whose flame could not be extinguished; Cernunnos, the antlered one who guarded the wild and the free; Morrigan, the queen who chose kings not by birth, but by worth. To the Church, they were not just false idols, they were competition. They offered a kind of divinity that needed no permission, no hierarchy, no gatekeeper. They taught that the sacred lived in craft, in word, in soil, in breath, and that was the one truth power could never afford. So their names were erased, their symbols buried, their festivals renamed, but the memory of them never left. It hid in the margins of manuscripts, in the spirals carved into ancient stone, in the songs of bards who refused to forget. Even as the Church built towers and cathedrals, the hills still whispered their names. Some said they became saints in disguise, others said they sank beneath the earth waiting. But the truth is simpler. They never left at all. They became the pulse beneath everything we call sacred. The Church feared them because they reminded humanity of something dangerous. That holiness was never about control, it was about connection. And the gods of the Celts embodied that in every breath. So tonight, we'll follow the trail they left behind. The songs, the symbols, the secrets that outlasted empire and faith alike. Because once, long before obedience was holy, the divine walked among us, and the Church feared them, not because they were false, but because they were free. They say there was a time when the Church feared not demons, but something older. Long before the cross rose over Ireland's hills, the priests whispered about lights that danced on the moors and voices that spoke in the wind. A letter once passed through Vatican hands, dated around the 5th century, warning of unruly rites in the West. It spoke of fires that burned through the night and songs that seemed to make the stars tremble. The Church called it heresy, the people called it home. Somewhere between the Latin prayers and the cries of ravens, two worlds began to collide, one built of stone and scripture, the other of river and root. To the bishops in Rome, these were pagans clinging to myth, but to those who lived in the mist, they were simply remembering gods that had never left. Every corner of the Celtic lands held their presence. In forests where the oak grew wide and ancient, they whispered. In wells so deep you could see your reflection ripple into another world, they waited. The priests sent to convert the islands wrote back of strange resistance, not defiance in arms, but in silence. The people would nod, attend mass, bow at the altar, then walk home and leave milk at the threshold for the unseen. A quiet rebellion, older than any empire. In Rome, the scholars tried to give these forces names. They wrote of false gods, of demons in disguise. But the monks who travelled north began to doubt. Some swore they felt something in the air, a hum that wrapped around them like memory. They wrote of bonfires on hilltops, where men and women danced without shame, where voices rose in languages the Church could not translate. They said the earth itself seemed alive, listening. The Vatican tried to stop it. They ordered crosses raised on the old mounds, chapels built over wells, and relics placed in caves once used for offerings. But still, the wind carried the names the church refused to write down. Lug, Brigid, Cernunnos, Morrigan. They were not forgotten, they were hiding. To call on them was not rebellion. It was remembering what the land had taught, long before anyone claimed dominion over faith. Some monks tried to reconcile the two worlds. They wrote in secret of how the old gods might not be devils at all, but echoes of something the church had lost. A faith born not of fear, but of connection, to sky, to fire, to water, to time. And that was the most dangerous idea of all, because control depends on separation, on believing that heaven and earth are divided. But the Celts never believed that. To them, every stone had a spirit, every storm had intent, and when the church looked into those forests, it didn't see ignorance, it saw competition, something too free to own. So the letters kept coming, reports of rites, of songs, of unholy silence. And behind every line was the same question, the same fear. What if these people were not lost souls to be saved, but guardians of a truth the church could never erase? Inside the cold stone walls of early monasteries, the air smelled of ink, wax, and silence. Monks bent over their desks by candlelight, copying scripture word by word, hour by hour, their fingers stained with black and red. Every page was a prayer, every letter a promise. But among the countless manuscripts written in those dim rooms, there was one that never appeared. A book the abbots would not copy. They knew it existed. They had seen fragments, lines written in strange script, stories that spoke of gods too old to name. The church called it dangerous. Not because it denied faith, but because it remembered what came before it. These stories were not about rebellion or sin. They were about harmony. Gods who walked with men, rivers that carried memory, and a world where everything was alive. But to write that down was to risk everything, because words have power, and the wrong ones could awaken the past. The monks were told to leave those pages blank, to skip entire passages when they found them. In the margins of some manuscripts, small symbols appeared, circles, spirals, faint markings that looked like decoration but carried meaning. Those who knew the old ways understood. It was how the forbidden survived, hidden between prayers. Scholars centuries later would find these gaps, wondering why whole sections of Celtic myth seemed to vanish around the 6th century. They called it coincidence, but silence, when repeated, becomes a language of its own. The abbots feared what those stories could remind people of, gods who did not demand worship but invited balance. To believe in them was to see no need for confession or hierarchy. If every hill, river, and flame held spirit, then no man could stand between another and the divine. That was the threat. Not heresy, but independence. Some monks, though, couldn't let it go. They copied what they could in secret, a verse hidden under a psalm, a name disguised as a saint, a myth retold as parable. Lug became Luke. Brigid became a virgin, blessed by heaven. The stories lived on, only wearing new robes. The church thought it had erased the gods, but they were only translated. In old Irish poems, in lullabies, in the carvings on standing stones, their echoes linger. You can still feel it in the rhythm of ancient prayers that mention light, fire, and craft. Those words aren't just metaphor, they are memory. Imagine a monk pausing over a forbidden line, quill shaking, hearing the wind outside whispering the names he's not allowed to write. He looks around the scriptorium. No one sees, so he writes it anyway, small enough to be mistaken for a smudge. That single act becomes a rebellion more lasting than any war. Centuries later, historians will find the missing pages, the blank spaces, and call it loss. But maybe it wasn't loss at all. Maybe it was preservation by omission. The church built libraries to control knowledge, but the silence inside them hid something older. The gods didn't die, they were just never copied. They called it the Island of Names, a place where every hill, stone, and wave remembered who it once was. The monks who first arrived on Ireland's shores thought they were bringing truth to a forgotten people. But what they found was a world already full of gods who didn't act like gods at all. The Tuatha De Danann. They weren't spirits locked in the clouds or chained to temples. They were memory made flesh, ancestors of craft and wisdom, rulers who could bleed, laugh, and lose. They built, they bargained, they fell, and they rose again. To the church, this was blasphemy. To the people, it was family. The stories said the Tuatha came in clouds, in mists, or in ships of silver. But what mattered wasn't how they arrived, it was that they stayed. They became the pulse of the land itself, gods who taught how to farm, forge, and heal, who made covenants not of faith but of understanding. To worship them wasn't to bow, but to remember. The church couldn't fit them into its order. These were not devils to condemn or saints to canonize. They were too human, too free. The monks tried to record their tales, but found them slippery. Every name led to another. Danu, the mother of all; Lug, the bright one; Brigid, the flame; the Morrigan, the crow of fate; Dagda, the good god with his endless cauldron. They weren't just deities. They were mirrors of what humans could be when they lived in balance with creation. That was the problem. The church preached hierarchy, heaven above and man below. The Tuatha spoke of circles, cycles, and contracts. They said no one ruled the world, they tended it. The missionaries listened, wrote, then rewrote. They turned the gods into kings, the queens into witches, the druids into sinners. But some of the scribes couldn't bring themselves to erase everything. They left clues, a line here, a name there. In one early Christian manuscript, a monk writes of shining ones who walked before Adam. Another mentions craftsmen born of light. These were the echoes of the Tuatha, the gods the church feared most, because they refused to disappear. Even as new saints rose, the old ones lingered under different names. When villagers prayed to Street Brigid for fertility or light, they weren't just following doctrine. They were remembering her flame at Kildare, still burning beneath the chapel. When they whispered blessings to the harvest, they were still calling to Lug, god of skill and promise. Every prayer, every song became a code. The people had learned to speak in two languages, one for the church and one for the earth. Over time, the Tuatha sank into myth, said to have gone underground, into the Seedha, the fairy mounds. But that was never exile, it was retreat. They became the memory beneath memory, waiting for when the world would listen again. The monks thought they had buried the old gods. Instead, they planted them. They said his name meant light. Lug of the long arm, the shining one, the master of every art. When he entered a hall, no one could name a skill he did not possess. Warrior, poet, smith, magician, harpist, healer. In every craft he was perfect, not because he ruled over others, but because he understood them all. To the people, he was inspiration made human. To the church, he was a problem that could not be contained. In the early centuries, when Christian scribes began rewriting the myths of the Tuatha De Danann, they stumbled on Lug's story and hesitated. How do you turn a god of light and talent into a sinner or a saint? You couldn't. He did not fit the mould. His festival, Lugnasad, was even worse for them. A day when no one prayed in Latin, when the people gathered on hilltops, danced in circles, shared bread and honey, and thanked the land itself for surviving another season. No altars, no priests, no sermons, just life celebrating itself. The church tried to rename it, to turn it into a harvest feast of saints, but the old songs wouldn't die. Even now, echoes of those songs survive in country fairs and summer blessings, hidden under names like Lammas. But the rhythm belongs to Lug. He terrified administrators because his story erased the need for a middleman. In Lug's world, learning was sacred not restricted. A child could pray through art, through work, through creation. No permission required. He was proof that divinity could live in skill, not just scripture. The monks who copied his tale often softened it, calling him a king or hero instead of a god. But even then, they couldn't erase his message. In one version, Lugh arrives at the gates of Tara, home of the gods. The guard asks his trade. Lugh says he is a smith. The guard replies, "We already have one." Lugh smiles. "Then, I am a poet. We have one of those too." And so it goes, until Lugh lists them all, every craft, every art, every science. Finally, the guard admits, "No man can be all things." And Lugh answers, "Then let me in, for I am one who unites them." That is why they feared him. Because if knowledge and creation belong to everyone, the gates of power fall open. The church survived on control, on dividing the sacred from the common, on deciding who could speak to God. But Lugh blurred that line. He turned work into prayer, imagination into worship. Farmers built small shrines to him in fields. Smiths whispered his name before lighting their forge. Poets claimed their words came from his breath. He was not just a god of light, he was a god of freedom, of knowing that mastery was not sin, but salvation. And though the church renamed his festival and painted over his image, they could never erase what he taught. That brilliance is divine, that art is prayer. And that light cannot be owned, only remembered. They say, her fire never went out. In the heart of Kildare, a flame burned day and night, tended by 19 women and guarded by silence. No man could cross its circle. The flame belonged to Brigid, goddess of poets, smiths, and healers, a keeper of wells and wisdom, a light that refused to dim. When the church arrived, they found her everywhere. Her name on the lips of mothers, her blessing spoken over newborns, her flame reflected in the eyes of those who refused to forget. The priests called it pagan. They ordered the fire extinguished. But no sooner was it put out than another appeared, this time inside the church itself. They could not destroy Brigid, so they baptized her. They gave her a new title, Saint Brigid of Kildare, and claimed she was a holy woman who founded a convent where the goddess once stood. But even beneath her saintly name, the old Brigid still burned. The people knew it. The wells dedicated to her still healed. The blacksmiths still whispered her name before striking metal. The poets still asked her for words when silence grew heavy. The church tried to rewrite her, but love is stubborn. It outlasts doctrine. Yet everyone knew whose fire it truly was. It was said that when the wind blew through the cloisters at night, it carried her voice, a promise that the sacred would always belong to the people, not just the priests. She was the goddess who became a saint, but only on the surface. In truth, she was the bridge between two worlds, her name meaning exalted one, her power flowing through wells and forges alike. She belonged to the earth, to craft, to birth, to poetry, to anything that gave life. The church tried to limit her to miracles, stories of charity and humility, but her spirit was too vast. She was creation itself, the fire that cooks, the forge that shapes, the inspiration that speaks. When the Vatican finally ordered her flame to be put out in the 16th century, saying it was superstition, people wept. Yet, in the 20th century, it was lit again, not by priests, but by women who remembered. The fire still burns today, just as it did before Christianity ever reached Ireland. Because Brigid was never just a goddess or a saint. She was a truth too ancient to fit inside a title. She proved that faith could live beyond temples, that holiness could be found in work and wonder. The priests who renamed her thought they had won. But every time a poet lights a candle for inspiration, every time a forge glows or a well is blessed, Brigid lives again. The church changed her name, but it never changed her essence. She is the flame that would not convert, the light that reminds us that the divine cannot be contained. It only transforms. and it always returns. In carvings found deep beneath old cathedrals, there is a figure the church never wanted to name. A man with the antlers of a stag, seated cross-legged between beasts, holding a serpent in one hand and a ring in the other. His name was Cernunnos, the Horned One, the god of wild things, of trade, of doorways between worlds. He was not a god of war, or law, or judgment. He was a god of balance. The people who once worshipped him saw him as the pulse of nature itself, the breath that moves between predator and prey, between hunter and hunted. He did not demand sacrifice. He asked for respect. For the church, this was dangerous. Because Cernunnos represented a kind of wealth they could not measure, an economy of giving and taking that belonged to the forest, not the altar. In his world, you did not pay for blessings, you offered gratitude. You did not tithe gold, you gave back to the land that fed you. It was a theology of reciprocity, where power flowed both ways, where even gods depended on the living earth. The priests called it heresy. To them, the wild was chaos, something to tame, something to fence off and own. But Cernunnos lived in what could not be owned. His temples were trees, his prayers were the calls of animals at dawn. He sat in doorways, not palaces, between this world and the next, reminding everyone that life was an exchange, not a hierarchy. Traders once carved his image on coins, believing his blessing would keep their hands honest and their scales fair. He was not a god of riches, but of circulation. He taught that what stops moving begins to die. That was what the church could never accept. Their wealth depended on stillness, on hoarding, on gates that closed. His depended on flow. When missionaries came to Celtic lands, they found his image everywhere, in jewellery, on stones, in stories whispered at firesides. They tried to turn him into the devil, the horned deceiver, twisting his antlers into symbols of sin. But the people knew better. The old women who left bread at crossroads, the hunters who muttered thanks after a kill, they still felt his gaze in the woods. Even as the cathedrals rose, the forests stayed alive with him. In secret songs, his name was spoken softly, not in fear, but in reverence. He was not against God, he was before God, a reminder of what existed long before borders and taxes. He was the keeper of the natural covenant. You take, you give, you live, you owe. When the church demanded obedience, Cernunnos taught balance. When it demanded gold, he offered gratitude. When it built walls, he stood in doorways. And maybe that is where he still stands, between belief and memory, waiting for us to remember that true faith is not what we own, but what we share. They said she appeared before battles, a woman wrapped in black feathers, her eyes bright as stormlight. To see her was both a warning and a blessing. She was the Morrigan, the queen of the battle crow, goddess of fate and sovereignty, the one who decided who would rise and who would fall. The church feared her not because she was evil, but because she answered to no one. She did not sit on a throne, nor bow to any crown. She chose kings, not by birth, but by worth. In a world built on inheritance and ordination, that was treason. The Morrigan's power was not about conquest, it was about balance. She appeared when power grew corrupt, when rulers forgot their duty to the land and the people. Her choice could not be bribed, blessed, or bought. She saw into the heart, and from that knowing, she crowned or destroyed. To the Celts, she was the spirit of the land itself, sovereignty made flesh. When a man became king, he did not just rule over soil and sword, he married the goddess through ritual, promising to protect her body, which was the earth. If he broke that promise, the land would wither, the rivers would turn to drought, his reign would end. The Morrigan's favour was not eternal, it was earned. The priests who came after her tried to erase that idea. They replaced her with queens who obeyed, saints who served, and angels who submitted. They wrote of the Morrigan as a witch, a temptress, a bringer of death, but even in their warnings, they could not hide her strength. In truth, she was the voice that asked every ruler the same question. Are you worthy? And that question terrified those who ruled by decree. Her name means Great Queen, but it also means phantom, because she is both real and beyond. She appears in three forms: maiden, mother, and crone, the cycle of life itself. She is not one woman, but many, a chorus of creation and destruction. When armies marched, she flew above them as a crow, watching, judging. When kings fell, she washed their armor in rivers, singing their names into history. The church could not contain her, because she did not belong to heaven or hell. She belonged to the in-between, where truth lives. To speak of her was to remember that power comes with responsibility, that no title is sacred if it forgets its purpose. The Morrigan is not cruel. She is honest. She is the reminder that every crown carries a cost, and every victory demands humility. Even now, her shadow lingers in stories, in dreams, in the dark wings that pass over battlefields. When the world forgets that leadership is a vow, not a privilege, she returns. The church built altars to obedience, but she remains the voice of accountability, whispering through time. The queen who does not wait for permission, who anoints not with oil, but with truth. The Morrigan, who teaches that real sovereignty cannot be given, it must be deserved. Before parchment and ink, before Latin and law, there were lines carved into stone, simple strokes, slanting and crossing, each one alive with meaning. This was Ogham, the first written language of the Celts, said to have been created by a god named Ogma, the champion of speech, the binder of words, the maker of meaning. To him, language was not just a tool, it was magic. Every sound carried force, every name carried truth. To speak was to shape reality. The church never liked that idea. Words, they said, must come from scripture, from authority, from the mouth of those chosen to speak for God. But Ogma had no patience for such limits. He taught that every person held power in their voice, that a promise spoken was sacred, that a lie could wound as surely as a blade. In the oldest tales, Ogma's words could pull men to his side, as if by chain. His eloquence bound armies, healed feuds, made kings listen. The harp was his companion, each string tuned to a different emotion, every note a spell. In his world, music and speech were the same thing, sound shaping soul. When the monks arrived in Ireland, they saw the Ogham marks carved into standing stones across the fields, boundary lines between clans, messages to the dead, prayers to unseen gods. They did not understand them, so they called them curses. But those lines were not curses, they were contracts. Proof that before canon law, there was a law of honour, a belief that truth could be written in stone, not just proclaimed from pulpits. The church feared that. A people who believed words had their own power did not need priests to give them meaning. They needed only to listen. And so Ogham was forbidden, its symbols replaced with Latin letters, its stones buried or used in walls. Yet, even as the church built its monasteries, the land remembered. The Ogham stones stayed, half hidden by moss, still whispering when the wind passed through their grooves. Scholars later called it a lost alphabet, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that knowledge does not belong to institutions. It belongs to those who speak. To this day, if you run your fingers across one of those ancient stones, you can almost feel the rhythm of the language. Each line carries intent, each mark a fragment of an older truth. Ogma taught that words were living things, and that silence was their grave. The priests wrote gospels to control belief. The druids carved Ogham to remember that belief cannot be owned. In every generation, someone rediscovers that power, the power of naming, of speaking, of singing the world into balance again. That is why Ogma was feared. Not because he defied God, but because he gave humanity the same gift, the word itself, the spell that binds and frees, the breath that makes us more than echo, the first and final magic. Language. They called him the good God, not because he was gentle, but because he was generous. The Dagda, father of plenty, keeper of the cauldron that never emptied, lord of the harp that could summon the seasons. To the Celts, he was the heart of abundance itself, a being who fed gods and mortals alike without asking for tribute or obedience. His feasts were open to all, his laughter shook the hills. His power came not from taking, but from giving, and that was what made the church tremble. A God who gives freely is a God who makes priests unnecessary. A world where no one hungers, where creation renews itself, leaves no room for fear, no need for penance or payment. The Dagda's cauldron was said to grant endless food, but it also symbolized something deeper. It was the idea that nature provides enough if greed does not interfere. In his myth, he plays his great harp after battles, commanding it to play the three songs of life: joy, sorrow, and sleep. When he played, the earth obeyed, the snows melted, the flowers returned, the world breathed again. To the Celts, he was not a distant god sitting on high. He was kin, a farmer, a craftsman, a lover of the simple things. His belly was full, his hands were rough, his heart was kind. He carried power like a harvest, to be shared, not hoarded. When the missionaries came, they found his story impossible to erase. So they mocked him. They turned him into a fool, a glutton, a relic of superstition. But that only proved how much he threatened them. Because his myth taught that authority meant responsibility, not control. That the measure of greatness was generosity. The church taught scarcity. The Dagda taught abundance. The two could never coexist. His very image, a bearded giant carrying a club in one hand and the cauldron in the other, reminded people that the divine was not hidden in cathedrals, but walking beside them in the soil, the rain, and the hearth fire. He did not ask for gold or prayer. He asked for gratitude, for laughter, for the courage to share. In him lived the memory of balance, of a time before shame and hierarchy, when food and song were sacred. The church replaced him with stories of miraculous loaves and fishes, but the lesson remained the same, only the ownership changed. They took what was communal and made it conditional. Yet the Dagda's spirit survived in the customs of giving, in the sharing of bread at wakes, in the fires lit at midwinter feasts. His cauldron became the hearth, his harp the wind through the trees, his generosity the quiet resistance of a people who refused to believe that holiness required hunger. The good God was never gone. He is there every time a table is set without measure, every time kindness outweighs power. The Dagda reminds us that the divine is not a crown or a sermon, but a full belly and a full heart, a world that gives without fear of running out. They said his cloak was made of mist, his voice carried on the tide, and his kingdom was never in one place for long. Manannán mac Lir, the son of the sea, lord of crossings, guardian of the unseen horizon. To sailors he was both guide and riddle. To priests he was a problem that refused to drown. Because how do you convert a god made of fog? How do you draw borders around the ocean? Manannán belonged to the in-between, the space where land fades and the unknown begins. His realm was motion, not monument. He ruled over the sea roads, the shifting paths that connected islands long before any church map existed. In those days, the Atlantic was not a wall, but a bridge. Traders, monks, and wanderers travelled by its secret currents, guided by stars, stories, and the whisper of this god who walked on water long before anyone claimed to. His magic was not in thunder or fire, but in concealment. When enemies came, he wrapped his followers in mist, hiding them from sight. When storms rose, he sent dreams to sailors, showing them safe harbours beyond the edge of the known world. He was not a god of conquest, he was a god of return, of homecoming. The church feared him because he represented freedom. Pilgrims who prayed to him did not need cathedrals or saints. Their church was the fog, their altar the tide. They could leave the shore and find sanctuary in the vast grey between. That was dangerous. The church needed walls. Manannán erased them. Even his stories defied structure. Sometimes he appeared as a king, other times as a beggar, testing kindness in strangers. Those who shared their bread found favor. Those who turned him away found their ships lost in endless mist. His lessons were quiet, but they cut deep. The sea gives and takes in equal measure, and only those who respect its balance find safe passage. When missionaries came to the coastal tribes, they built churches near harbours, hoping to replace his name with new prayers. But fishermen still poured ale into the waves before sailing, still whispered to the fog when the world grew too heavy to see. The old rituals survived beneath Christian robes, because people knew that the sea did not care for doctrine, it cared for honesty. Manannan's presence became a metaphor, a reminder that mystery is not something to fear, but to enter. His cloak of mist was the veil between worlds, life and death, land and dream. To the faithful, he was myth. To those who understood, he was memory itself, the part of the world that refuses to be charted. Even now, when the fog rolls in thick and silent, when the horizon disappears, and you cannot tell where the water ends or the sky begins, that is his domain, the God who protects what cannot be owned, the Lord of crossings, the keeper of the mist. Manannan Mac Lir, whose sanctuary was the sea, and whose faith was freedom. They were called the four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, gifts carried from the other world when the gods first came to Ireland, a spear that never missed its mark, a sword that revealed truth by cutting through deceit, a stone that cried out beneath the feet of the rightful king, and a cauldron that never ran empty, feeding all who approached. They were not just objects, they were symbols, each one a mirror of the human spirit, will, truth, justice, renewal. Together they formed a code, a reminder that divine power was not about domination but balance. The church saw them differently. To them, these treasures were dangerous because they taught that holiness could exist without hierarchy. You did not need a priest to speak for you, only the courage to hold your own power, the clarity to seek truth, the fairness to rule justly, and the generosity to share what you had. So, when the missionaries arrived, they recast the treasures as relics, lifeless echoes of the divine. The spear became a weapon of saints, dipped in the blood of Christ. The sword became a symbol of crusades, wielded for conquest instead of clarity. The stone, once a living judge of kings, was turned into a relic to be kissed, not questioned. And the cauldron, that sacred vessel of endless giving, was replaced by chalices of gold, guarded by those who preached scarcity. What had once been lessons became trophies. The meaning was drained, leaving only the image. But the old stories remembered. The spear was the will to act with purpose, to strike not for victory, but for truth. The sword was the mind that cuts through lies, even those spoken by power. The stone was conscience, the voice that refuses to be silenced. The cauldron was compassion, the heart that gives even when the world says to hoard. Each treasure held a wound because every virtue has a cost. Will can harden into pride, truth can isolate, justice can be merciless, generosity can be exploited. The Celts understood this. They believed that to carry any one treasure, you had to bear its burden. Power without pain was corruption. The Church, however, preferred simplicity. It turned complexity into commandment, tools into symbols, symbols into control. But myths are stubborn things. Even stripped of their old names, the treasures survived. The spear lived on in every act of courage, the sword in every question that cuts through falsehood, the stone in every protest that demands accountability, the cauldron in every meal shared freely among the forgotten. The relics of the church may rest in glass cases, but the real treasures still move among us. They are not gold or steel, but ideas, living reminders that truth cannot be owned, and that the sacred was never meant to sit behind locked doors. The four treasures remain, shining quietly in every act of will, justice, clarity, and compassion. The gifts of gods, the tools of humans, the map back to ourselves. There was once a year when the bells would not ring. The priests pulled their ropes, but the air stayed still, as if the sound had been swallowed by the land itself. The people said it was because the old gods were listening, because the earth still kept its own calendar, no matter how many new ones were nailed to the church doors. Before the saints and sermons, time in the Celtic world was a living thing. The year turned not by decree, but by fire, frost, and sunlight. Each season was a conversation between the world and the people who walked it. Samhain marked the end of the harvest and the thinning of the veil between life and death. Imbolc brought the promise of renewal, Brigid's blessing stirring in the frozen soil. Beltane lit the hills with flames of fertility and freedom. Lughnasadh honoured the first fruits, the labour of the fields, and the bond between gods and humans. These were not holidays, they were agreements, sacred pacts written in the rhythm of nature. When the church rose, it tried to take hold of that rhythm. It declared its own holy days, built its own clock of faith. Samhain became All Hallows, Imbolc became Candlemas. Beltane was recast as May Day. Lughnasadh folded into the Feast of Saints and Harvest Masses. The new bells replaced the old fires, but the land did not forget. Crops still grew on their own schedule, animals still mated with the moon, and the people, quietly, still honoured the old names beneath the new prayers. The priests called it superstition. The peasants called it survival. The church's calendar was built to measure devotion, but the Celtic wheel measured belonging. To them, time was not a straight line from creation to judgment. It was a circle, eternal and breathing, where death fed life and endings were beginnings. The bells that year failed because the seasons would not bend. The mists came early. The cattle refused to move. Even the rivers froze late, as if the world itself rejected the edits to its song. The church tried to preach order, but the festivals kept returning, no matter how often they were renamed. At night, fires still burned on hillsides. Offerings of bread and milk still vanished from doorsteps. Children were still told that on Samhain the ancestors walked among them. The priests wrote sermons against it, but deep down, even they knew the truth. You cannot overwrite a heartbeat with ink. The Celtic year was more than ritual. It was a map of relationship, a way to live in harmony with what could not be controlled. The liturgical year could silence bells, but it could not stop the wind from carrying the smell of smoke from ancient fires. The land kept its time, and sometimes, when the night was still and the mist hung low, even the church bells seemed to hesitate, waiting for the earth to speak first. When the monks began to write, the bards began to whisper. It was not war in the open sense, but something quieter, slower, far more dangerous. A war for memory. The monks copied gospels, chronicles, and laws approved by bishops. Their pens turned history into scripture, neat and orderly. But the bards, the poets of the old ways, remembered what the ink left out. They carried the lineages of kings who never knelt to Rome, the songs of gods disguised as ancestors, and the truths that could not fit between the margins of a holy book. The church built monasteries of stone. The bards built their libraries in air and sound. Every night around fires, their voices rose like wind through leaves, shaping memory with rhyme and rhythm. In those verses lived names the monks refused to record. Queens who ruled before coronations, warriors who spoke to spirits, healers who used words as medicine. The monks said these were myths. The bards said myths were memories the church could not own. One worked by daylight, the other by moonlight. By day, the monks preached order, obedience, and salvation. By night, the bards reminded people of freedom, of balance, of a time when truth did not need permission. To the priests, words were sacred only when written. To the bards, words were alive only when spoken. A story forgotten was a soul unburied. That belief terrified those who ruled through silence. so the church tried to tame them. Some bards were hired by monasteries to turn old songs into safe versions, legends rewritten with saints instead of gods. Others were punished, their tongues cut, their art dismissed as drunken babble. But memory has a way of surviving when it's sung. The rhythm made it unkillable. Even when stories were banned, the melodies stayed. A mother humming to her child, a shepherd whistling in the hills, a traveller reciting a verse to pay for shelter. The oral chain never broke. In the dim corners of the abbey, even some monks secretly wrote down what they heard, unable to resist the beauty of it. Over time, those fragments became the backbone of what we now call Celtic mythology. The very tales the church tried to erase lived on because someone refused to stop singing. The bards were not rebels in armour, they were guardians of time. Their rebellion was in remembering. And every time a voice repeated an old name, the spell continued. The war for memory never ended in flames or victory. It ended in endurance, in the quiet triumph of story over silence. Today, when you read a line about Brigid, Lug, or the Morrigan, you are hearing them still, the bards who kept the past alive when it was forbidden to exist. The monks may have written history, but the bards kept truth breathing. And somewhere between parchment and poetry, a civilization remembered itself. If you read the lives of the saints carefully, you start to notice the seams. Stories that glow with something older, something wilder, hiding just beneath the surface. Miracles that sound less like Christian virtue and more like the echoes of forgotten gods. The church called them saints, but their bones were built from older myths. In the weaving of new faith over old, the gods were not destroyed, they were disguised. Brigid became Saint Brigid. Her sacred flame turned into a symbol of virtue instead of divinity. But the flame never went out. The nuns at Kildare kept it burning day and night for centuries, just as her priestesses had done before the first cross ever rose on Irish soil. Her holy wells remained, her blessings for poets and smiths unchanged. The goddess had simply traded her crown for a veil. Columba was said to drive monsters from lakes and speak with angels. But the tales mirror the deeds of older druidic heroes who spoke to spirits and commanded beasts with song. Patrick, the bringer of Christianity to Ireland, was said to drive the snakes from the island, but there were no snakes in Ireland. What he drove out was symbol, the serpentine wisdom of the Druids. Even the church's own writers could not hide the pagan bones beneath the saintly flesh. The miracles were too familiar, too close to the stories the people already loved. When Christianity spread through the Celtic lands, it could not conquer by sword alone. It had to blend, to reshape, to stitch itself onto the myths that had shaped the hearts of the people. Every time a pagan festival was replaced by a feast day, every time a goddess became a saint, the church thought it was winning, but in truth, it was preserving. Like embroidery sewn over an old garment, the threads of myth still shimmered through. The people prayed to saints who healed cows, blessed crops, guarded the hearth, and walked between worlds. They said the names had changed, but the powers remained. Even the clergy began to sense it, calling the Celtic lands stubborn, half-converted, too fond of miracles that didn't match the Bible. But maybe that was the point. The gods had not vanished. They had adapted. They wore halos instead of crowns, carried crosses instead of spears, but their essence lingered. Compassion, courage, transformation. The same forces that once moved through the Tuatha De Danann now spoke through the saints of Ireland and Scotland. The church wanted obedience. The land gave them memory. And in that memory, the old gods smiled through borrowed names. To this day, when people light candles for Brigid or bless their fields in her name, they are keeping that secret alive. The saints became the mask of myth, but masks can never fully hide the face beneath. Somewhere under the Latin prayers and holy titles, the goddess still whispers. You can hear her in the wind that moves through the reeds, in the fire that refuses to die, in the stitching that still shows. There is a hill in Ireland where no church will stand. The priests tried again and again, They brought stones from the valley, blessed the ground, laid foundations, and prayed. But each morning, the walls they built were gone, the stones scattered down the slope, as if rolled by invisible hands. The villagers said the hill had refused. Long before the church came, that hill was a place of gathering, a centre of the old faith. Fires had burned there for Beltane. Oaths were spoken under stars. The land itself was alive with memory. The priests called it superstition. The people called it respect. Across Ireland and Scotland, the same stories repeat. Churches that collapse, towers that lean, wells that bubble with strange lights. Places where the old power lingers and refuses to be buried. The church learned to work around them, but never over them. They built near the sacred wells, not on top. They carved crosses into standing stones, hoping to tame their energy, but the carvings only made them stronger, binding both worlds together. The land kept its secrets, and sometimes it fought back. At fairy forts, rings of ancient earth, where people said spirits danced, the church forbade offerings, yet farmers still left milk or bread on moonlit nights. Those who didn't often found their crops blighted or their tools broken. Whether curse or coincidence, no one dared test the boundary twice. The priests sent letters to Rome asking what to do about these stubborn places, but even Rome could not answer. How do you sanctify what is already sacred? Some holy wells were renamed after saints, their waters blessed and their legends rewritten, but the locals still whispered the old prayers when no one was listening. In the round towers that dot the countryside, historians saw fortresses or bell towers, yet the people said they were built on the bones of older rituals, the towers reaching skyward like stone prayers to gods forgotten but not gone. Each tower, each mound, each ring of stones was an act of unpermission, a quiet defiance against erasure. The church wanted dominion over the spiritual landscape, but the land itself refused ownership. It chose who could stay, who could build, who could belong. The priests built their churches anyway, but the people remembered which hills to walk around, which trees to greet, which wells to honor. They knew that holiness did not depend on permission. It lived in the places where time folds, where heaven and earth touch without needing a priest to introduce them. The hill that refused a church became a story told across centuries, a reminder that faith cannot be forced. Some say the hill still hums at night, the echo of ancient songs moving through its roots. And when the mist settles over its slopes, no bell rings, no sermon sounds, only silence, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of a world that remembers who it is. When the church could not erase knowledge, it outlawed it. The Index of Forbidden Books listed every text too dangerous to read, too curious to question, too alive to burn quietly. But Ireland had never been a place that obeyed silence. What could not be taught in classrooms found its way to the hedgerows. There, under the open sky, a new kind of school was born. They called them hedge schools, where teachers met in secret with children and wanderers, teaching history, poetry, and faith the way it was meant to be remembered, not written. Lessons were whispered beside stone fences, pages passed like contraband between cupped hands. In these quiet corners of the countryside, the old gods and the forbidden thinkers survived side by side. It was not rebellion in the grand sense. It was survival through memory. The priests in their monasteries taught Latin, catechism, and obedience. The hedge teachers taught language, land, and lineage. They carried stories that the Index had blacklisted, tales of Brigid as goddess, not saint, of the Tuatha De Danann as ancestors, not demons. They read fragments of the Hermetica, the poems of old bards, and even translations of books banned by Rome. To the church this was heresy, to the people it was hope. In those hidden gatherings, knowledge became a living fire, passed from hand to hand so it would never die. The church burned books, but it could not burn memory. Each lesson spoken aloud was another spark in the dark. They say the hedge teachers worked by moonlight, using the rhythm of songs to disguise their lessons. To an outsider, it sounded like a folk tune. To those who listened, it was history. A hedge school might vanish in a night, only to reappear miles away, carried by rumour and need. They left no buildings, no archives, only minds filled with truth. Even as the Vatican issued new bans, the stories grew stronger, richer, more defiant. When power tries to own truth, truth moves. It hides in places that power cannot reach. In the hum of the fields, in the whisper of wind between stones, in the tongues of those who refuse to forget. The hedge teachers were keepers of that flame. They taught that no one could forbid what is already part of the soul, that the divine is not a book to censor, but a voice to hear. Some were caught, punished, forced into silence. But for every one silenced, two more rose. The hedge schools became sanctuaries of forbidden light, where myth, reason, and spirit could breathe again. The index has long since faded into history, but the idea remains. Every time someone questions the story they are told, every time knowledge is passed in secret, a hedge school is reborn. It reminds us that truth, once awakened, cannot be contained. It will always find its way through the hedges, into the hearts of those still willing to learn. They say it happened one winter night, when a bishop travelling through the Irish countryside heard a cry rising from the hills. It was not the sound of an animal or the wind, but something between a song and a scream, filled with sorrow so deep it stopped his heart. His guards crossed themselves, whispering that the Bean City had come, the woman of the fairy mound, the spirit who keens before death. The bishop ordered them to pray, but even he could not look away when she appeared in the mist, hair like rain, eyes shining with tears that were not her own. She sang for someone about to die, though no one knew who. The church had long forbidden keening, calling it pagan and indecent. They said grief must be contained within prayer, not wailed into the sky. But the people still believed that the dead deserved song, that to cry for them was to guide their souls safely home. The Bean Siddur was not a ghost to them. She was a goddess of mourning, a sacred witness to loss. Her voice was the bridge between worlds. The bishop, shaken, demanded she stop, yet the sound only grew. It filled the valley like a tide, soft and terrible. The horses reared, the candles blew out. When dawn came, one of the bishop's own men was found dead in his sleep. From that day, the bishop never mocked the cries of women who wailed at funerals. He knew they were not madness, they were memory. In the old world, grief was communal. When someone died, the women of the village would gather and keen through the night, their voices weaving together until it seemed the whole earth mourned. The church tried to silence them, replacing song with silence, emotion with obedience. They said grief belonged to priests and confession, not to mothers or widows. But grief cannot be tamed by doctrine. It is a river that must run. The Bean Siddur reminded people that sorrow was not sin, that to mourn was holy. In time, her name became a whisper of warning, but also of reverence. Even priests learned to listen when they heard her voice, knowing it meant the veil had thinned. The church called her a demon. The people called her truth. For centuries, they told stories of bishops who denied her, only to find death at their own door. She was not evil, she was honest. Her song carried the weight of what every soul must face. In her cry lived compassion, the sound of love refusing to be quiet. When grief has a goddess, penance loses its monopoly. Because the Bean Siddur does not demand confession, she gives permission to feel, to weep, to remember, and that is something no institution can own. Even now, when a sudden wind rises at night and the air hums like a voice half hidden in mist, the old people still pause. They say she is passing by, singing for someone whose name is already known beyond this world. There were three kinds of people the church never fully trusted: the smith, the seer, and the midwife. Each one touched a mystery that could not be controlled. The smith shaped metal with fire, the seer shaped time with vision, and the midwife shaped life itself. Together, they formed a triad older than Scripture, a balance of creation that no canon law could explain. The Church preached that all miracles came from God, yet these three made their own. The smith's forge glowed like a miniature sun, his hammer striking sparks that reminded people of lightning and the gods who once wielded it. Villagers said a smith's hands could heal wounds or curse weapons. He knew how to bend the hardest elements on earth and turn them into tools or thrones. The Church feared that kind of mastery. Fire belonged on the altar, not in the hands of men. So they called his craft dangerous, even demonic. But still, every monastery needed one. Even priests prayed that their bells and chalices be forged by honest hands. The seer was worse. The one who saw beyond days and dreams, who read omens in clouds, water, or stars. The Church taught that only prophets of the Bible could see the future, but the seers of the Celtic lands had been reading the sky since before Latin was written. They did not claim power. They claimed pattern. They saw time as a circle, not a line, and in that circle they could trace what was coming. When plagues or storms appeared, people turned to them, not the pulpit. The Church called it witchcraft. The people called it wisdom. Then there was the midwife, the most feared of all. She held the power of life in her hands, knowing secrets that no priest could understand. While men prayed for souls, she caught them as they entered the world. Her touch was sacred, her knowledge passed down through generations of women who spoke quietly of herbs, pain, and protection. The Church tried to replace her with holy water and confession, but when birth came, no priest could help. The midwife became the last link to the goddess, to Brigid and Danu, to the divine feminine that the new faith had tried to erase. Each of these professions was watched, questioned, sometimes condemned, but never replaced. They existed in the margins, carrying the old ways forward in silence. The smith kept the flame alive. The seer kept the calendar true. The midwife kept the sacred body unforgotten. The Church could call it superstition, but superstition is just memory that refuses to die. These people were not rebels. They were caretakers of balance. Every spark, every prophecy, every birth reminded the world that the sacred was not locked in cathedrals. It lived in the forge, in the stars, and in the arms that welcomed new life. And for as long as fire burns, time turns, and life begins, their work continues. Hidden perhaps, but eternal. Once upon a time, the animals spoke for the gods. The forests of Ireland were full of messengers in fur and feather, creatures that carried meaning between worlds. The white stag led heroes into the mist, guiding them from the mortal realm into the other world. The salmon of wisdom swam in a sacred pool beneath hazel trees, its flesh granting understanding to whoever tasted it. Red-eared hounds hunted on the borders of reality, their cries echoing from a place beyond death. Every animal was a symbol, every colour a sign. The Celts saw no divide between myth and nature. But when the Church arrived, those creatures began to vanish, not in flesh, but in meaning. Monks writing bestiaries, the animal encyclopedias of the Middle Ages, quietly changed the details. The stag was no longer white, the hounds no longer red, the salmon became just a fish. The stories stayed, but the trail was broken. Colour, in those days, was language. White meant the veil between worlds, red meant spirit and sacrifice, gold meant the divine. To change the colour was to change the truth. The Church knew this. They did not need to burn every story, only to dull it, and so they did. Manuscripts that once described shimmering beasts of prophecy began to describe simple creatures of the field. What had been sacred became ordinary. What had been mystical became moral. The white stag that once guided souls became a test of temptation, a warning against wandering. The salmon that once taught poets became a symbol of gluttony. The hounds of the otherworld, who once guarded the dead, became demons in disguise. The transformation was subtle but complete. Nature lost its voice. The old people still remembered, though. In folk tales whispered around fires, they kept the colours alive. A child born with red hair was said to be marked by the hounds. A white animal seen at dusk was a sign of a spirit nearby. These details slipped past the censors, hidden in rhyme and superstition. Even when the monks erased the words, the people painted them back into the land. Stags still roamed the forests. Salmon still leapt from silver streams. And when the mist rolled in thick and the world seemed to shimmer, some swore they could still see the old colours return. The church taught that animals were beneath man, but the Celts had known better. They believed that wisdom walked on 4 legs, flew on feathered wings, or swam beneath the surface where light could not reach. To lose those colours was to lose a kind of sight, the ability to read the world as text. But the text is still there. You only have to look. The trail may be faint, but it was never broken completely. The white stag still runs, the salmon still waits, and the red hounds still howl when the moon rises over ancient hills. The otherworld never left. It only learned to hide in plain sight. Long before kings wore crowns, or swore oaths before bishops, they placed their bare feet on stone. The old kingship rights of Ireland were not about power over people, but about union with the land. The stone was called Lia Fáil, the stone of destiny, and it was said to cry out when the true king stood upon it. The ritual was not performed in chapels or halls, but under open sky, surrounded by wind and witness. The chosen one would pledge himself to the earth, promising to protect it as his own body. His reign would last only as long as the land thrived. If famine came or rivers ran dry, it meant the bond was broken. The church could never accept such a covenant. It left no room for divine right or papal blessing. It made sovereignty a contract between man and nature, not man and God, so they changed it. The stones were silenced, the rites rewritten, the old promises replaced by Latin ceremony. Kings were now anointed with oil, not crowned by earth. The bishops stood in place of the goddess, their words claiming heaven's authority, while the ground beneath them went unacknowledged. Yet the stones remained. In Tara, in Scotland, in Wales, in hidden fields where shepherds still whispered their names. Some were moved to churches, built into walls, or buried under altars. But they could not be forgotten. Even in their silence, they carried memory. In the Celtic world, sovereignty had once been embodied as a goddess. She appeared as a woman who offered the king a cup. To drink from it was to accept his duty to the land. To refuse was to lose the crown. It was not lust or legend, it was law. The church tried to erase her, calling her a witch or a test of virtue. But she was not temptation, she was truth. The earth itself, asking only that those who ruled did so with humility. The priests found this terrifying because it meant power came from below, not above. A man could be chosen by the soil as easily as by the sky. The Lia Fáil no longer cries out, they say, because there are no kings who remember how to listen. But sometimes, during storms, when thunder shakes the hills, locals swear they can hear it hum. A low sound like the pulse of the world itself, remembering its covenant. Even now, the footprints carved into those stones remain, faint but eternal. They mark the places where rulers once stood barefoot, feeling the cold breath of the earth under their skin. They remind us that authority without connection is hollow, that the land does not serve the throne serves the land. The church built its cathedrals of marble and gold, but the true temple was underfoot all along. The stones are still waiting, silent and patient, for someone brave enough to listen again. In a monastery by the Western Sea, a group of monks once spent their lives painting light onto pages. They called it illumination, the sacred craft of turning words into visions. Their brushes were made of feather and fur, their colours from crushed stone and gold leaf. Each stroke was a prayer, but hidden among the vines and halos, between the Latin and the light, something else was speaking. If you look closely at those ancient manuscripts, you'll find it. Antlers curling through margins, triple spirals woven into corners, patterns too old to belong to Christendom. The monks were painting around a god. They could not write his name, but they remembered his form. The horned one, the sun in his season, the life force in all things. They disguised him in foliage, in knotwork, in the endless loops of eternal design. To the abbots, these were decoration. To the monks who painted them, they were devotion. The church believed the monasteries to be fortresses of orthodoxy, but they were also sanctuaries for memory. Many of the monks were descendants of druids, raised on stories their vows forbade them to tell. So they told them differently, through colour, through shape, through gold. Every illuminated page became a battlefield between old gods and new, and the victory was never absolute. In the Book of Kells, in the Lindisfarne Gospels, in the hidden scrolls of Iona, the sacred and the secret live side by side. Spirals echo the cycles of birth and decay. Vines twist into symbols of infinity. Even the faces of angels sometimes look too wild, too human, their eyes hinting at something far older than Christian heaven. The church saw beauty, the artists saw remembrance. They were painting not just words of scripture, but the book of the world itself, the story written in stone, storm, and seed. To paint the divine was to confess that it lived everywhere, in water, in light, in breath. The monks knew that truth could survive even inside cages, so they carved it into corners where no censor thought to look. In one manuscript, a deer kneels before a cross, its antlers tangled with ivy. To the bishops, it was a symbol of piety. To those who knew, it was Cernunnos blessing the new god, a peace treaty in gold. The monks never stopped believing, they just learned to hide belief in beauty. Centuries later, scholars would study the patterns, calling them Celtic art, never realizing they were prayers from two worlds woven into one. The gold leaf still catches the light today, reflecting something deeper than faith, something like memory. The monastery may have thought it served heaven, but in truth, it served both heaven and earth. The artists who worked there left a message in every curve and colour that the divine cannot be erased. It only changes form, waiting in the margins for those with eyes to see. The book of the world still whispers, and its words are written in gold. There was a time when seeing was not a sin. In the old world, vision was a gift, a sign that a person could walk between what was and what might be. They called it the second sight, the eye that never closed, the way to glimpse the hidden threads of fate. Seers, prophets, and dreamers were honoured, not feared. But when the church took hold, sight became something to control. Only the chosen could claim visions, only saints could speak with the divine. Anyone else was a danger. Those who saw too much were branded heretics. Their dreams turned into crimes. The gift became a curse. In Ireland and Scotland, people whispered about the fairy sight, the ability to see beyond the veil. Some saw the dead walking beside the living. Some saw omens before storms or deaths. Some simply saw beauty in places others passed without notice. The church called it illusion, temptation, madness. It began to tell stories of saints who had their mouths sewn shut after speaking their visions aloud. Holy tales meant to warn that revelation without permission was rebellion. But the real message was clear. Do not see what we do not show you. Do not hear what we do not bless. Still, the sight persisted. Women felt it strongest. They dreamed of fires before they came, of births and deaths, of rivers turning strange colours. The priests accused them of witchcraft. Yet sometimes, when their warnings proved true, those same priests turned their stories into miracles, naming them saints after death to hide their fear. Seeing was dangerous because it broke the monopoly on mystery. The church needed to be the sole interpreter of heaven. But the second sight belonged to no one. It was wild, unpredictable, and deeply human. The seers spoke of light that burned not in the sky but behind the eyes, a light that could not be dimmed by doctrine, that frightened power more than any weapon could. Visionaries disappeared into monasteries, where their dreams were studied, rewritten, or erased. Others vanished into folklore, remembered as witches, wise men, or cursed poets. In truth, they were none of these. They were simply awake. The world still holds their memory. The phrase, "to have the sight," survives in stories told by firelight, spoken softly as if the walls might be listening. Even now, there are those who claim to dream of things before they happen, to feel echoes in places where time folds. Science may call it chance, religion may call it blasphemy, but the heart knows what it knows. To see beyond is to remember that not everything real can be explained. The Church built its faith on revelation, yet feared those who received it freely. The trials of the second sight were not about heresy, they were about ownership of truth. And perhaps that is why the gift has never left us. Because sight cannot be chained. It waits in the dark, patient, until someone dares to look again. When the Church forbade the old gods, the people did not stop believing. They simply changed the language. Names once spoken in temples became whispers in the wind. Prayers once offered at standing stones turned into casual blessings before a journey or a harvest. The gods became weather. Their power moved into fog, rain, thunder, and luck. When a fisherman thanked the sea for mercy, he was still speaking to Manannán mac Lir. When a farmer looked at the sun and murmured gratitude for warmth, he was still calling to Lug. When a woman left milk on her doorstep for protection, she was still honouring Brigid. The Church thought it had erased the old ways, but it only made them invisible. Every storm, every rainbow, every mist that rolled across the hills became a sermon written by the land itself. The people learned to read it quietly. They said luck when they meant blessing. They said weather when they meant will. They said chance when they meant God. The wind became the last free altar. It asked for no offering but awareness. In the countryside, priests tried to stop the small rituals that tied faith to nature. They preached that weather was punishment or reward, controlled only by heaven. But the villagers knew better. They could feel how the world responded to respect. When you took too much, the rain stayed away. When you gave back, the earth bloomed. The gods had not gone. They had diffused into everything. The storms that swept over the Atlantic were not chaos. They were voices, still speaking, still watching. The fog that drifted through valleys was not emptiness. It was presence. In spring, altars would reappear as if by accident. Stones stacked neatly beside wells, ribbons tied to sacred trees, flowers placed in circles that no one admitted to making. The Church called it habit. The people called it luck. But beneath that word lived memory. Luck was not random. It was relationship, a quiet understanding that the world listens when you honour it. The gods had become shy, but not silent. They were in the air that moved across the barley, in the first drops of dew, in the patterns of clouds. Each season was their slow return. The Church could name the months, but the land kept its own calendar. When the wind changed direction, the elders would say the gods were walking. When thunder rolled, they said it was Dagda's harp. When a sudden calm followed rain, they said Morrigan had passed, satisfied for now. These phrases survived as superstition, but they were really prayers wearing disguise. Even now, when someone looks at the sky and senses meaning in the weather, the old faith stirs. The gods do not demand temples, they live in what moves. In every gust of wind, in every fog that hides and reveals, in every coincidence we call luck, they are there, smiling at how belief always finds a way to come back home. It began with a whisper. Someone, somewhere, said a name they were never meant to say again. Lug, a sound older than language, rolling softly like thunder over hills that had forgotten how to answer. Then another voice joined, saying, Brigid. Then another, speaking Cernunnos. And when the last voice rose, calling Morrigan, the silence broke. The air seemed to stir, as if the world had been waiting for those names to return. The people did not shout them. They spoke them gently, reverently, as if introducing themselves to the earth again. For centuries, the Church had taught that these names were forbidden, their gods buried beneath layers of saints and scripture. But you cannot bury what still breathes in the roots of trees and the rhythms of rain. Saying their names was not rebellion, it was remembrance, it was a covenant renewed. To speak Lug was to honour craft, the light of skill and learning that no one can own. To speak Brigid was to honour creation, the fire that shapes art and life alike. To speak Cernunnos was to honour balance, the wild harmony between give and take. To speak Morrigan was to honour truth, the courage to face endings and still stand. Each name was a seed waking in the dark, a reminder that the divine was never confined to heaven, but lived beneath our feet. The Church had feared these names because they gave power back to the people. To say them was to claim your place in the story of the world, not as subject but as participant. It meant the sacred was no longer distant. It was here, in the breath, in the body, in the work of hands and heart. That day, the bells of the cathedrals rang, but they could not drown out the sound of the land remembering itself. Wind moved through the trees like a sigh of relief. Streams glittered with sunlight, as if smiling. In that moment, the gods were not summoned. They had never left. They had only been waiting for someone brave enough to speak. And once spoken, they returned not as rulers, but as reflections. They lived in the craftsman's hammer, in the poet's song, in the healer's touch. They lived in every act of connection that defied fear. The fear now belonged to silence, the silence that had once been used to erase them. To speak was to heal, to name was to awaken. The old stories tell that when the gods first left the mortal world, they promised to come back when called with respect, not with worship, and so they did. The day we said their names was not a return to paganism or a rejection of faith. It was an awakening to memory. It was the moment humanity remembered that divinity does not live in power but in presence. And as the wind carried those names across the fields, something in the world exhaled. The book closed where it began, not in darkness, but in light.